Okay, hello. How are you doing? Okay, we're going to do a podcast now, an environmental podcast. In this podcast, I will discuss some of the many issues that affect our environment because it is our home and it has been the home of our ancestors since the beginning of human time on Earth. I believe it is the job of anybody that cares about the environment to educate the youth and provide them with necessary tools and knowledge to deal with the environmental crisis. Starting off, I will give some information on the development of the environmental movement over the years. I will also talk about the difference between conservation and preservation of our natural environment. These topics have been the centre of many historical debates and for a lot of people might seem to be two sides of the same coin, but there are some stark contrasts, which we will talk about later. Many people have become detached from the environment for many different reasons, and this detachment makes it difficult for environmentalists to spread the message of conserving and preserving the natural environment. This podcast will also include the impact that some outdoor activities have on the natural landscape outdoors and the flora and fauna that we'll find out there. From my personal experience and from what I have researched, I will discuss some of the ways to minimize these impacts. To finish, I will talk briefly about the Leave No Trace principles, as I believe the organisation does great work for the environmental movement. Okay, development of the environmental movement. Next, I want to go into development of the environmental movement. After reading an interesting article on the Encyclopedia Britannica titled Environmentalism, Ideology, History and Types, I've taken some excerpts from this article to talk about. Firstly, I would like to mention a few of the names of people involved in this movement, starting with John Muir. He's a Scottish-born American influential naturalist and conservationist who was the founder of the Sierra Club and lived from 1838 to 1914. Different from the influences that we're used to today, his writings contributed greatly to the creation of Yosemite, Sequoia, Mountain Rainier, Petrified Forest and the Grand Canyon National Parks. Dozens of places are named after John Muir, including Muir Woods National Monument, the John Moore Trail, Moore College, UCSD, and many schools. Following on, I would like to focus on a man named Gifford Pinchot, who was born in 1865 and died in 1946. Who was the first chief of the US Forest Service. Here's a quote from the man himself. "When I came home, not a single acre of government, state or private timberland was under systematic forest management anywhere on the most richly timbered of all continents. When, in the gay 90s, the common word for our forests was inexhaustible, to waste timber was a virtue and not a crime. There would always be plenty of timber. The lumberman regarded forest devastation as normal as second growth, as a delusion of fools, and as for sustained yield, no such idea had ever entered their heads. The few friends the forest had were spoken of. When they were spoken of at all, as impractical theorists, fanatics, or denudicts, more or less touched in the head. What talk was there about forest protection was no more to the average American than the buzzing of a mosquito, and just about as irritating." This quote was taken from the Gerard Picher, an article in the Washington DC Island Press in 1998, breaking new ground. Lastly, I would like to talk about Aldo Leopold, who was born in 1887 and died in 1948, and his land ethic theory, which is humans should transform themselves from conquerors of nature into citizens of it. This powerful quote, among his other great works on forestry, is the reason his book, A Sand County Almanac, sold over 2 million copies a year after he died in 1949. Concern for the impact of human life on problems such as air and water pollution dates back to at least Roman times. In China, India and Peru, soil conservation was practiced as early as 2,000 years ago. The contemporary environmental movement arose primarily in the late 19th century about the protection of the countryside in Europe and the wilderness in the United States. Also, questions raised about the consequences of pollution during the Industrial Revolution brought some environmental activists out of the woodwork. People were taking natural resources and transforming them into products that they wanted. Trees turned into homes and furniture resulted in mass deforestation. And burning coal for energy and electricity has polluted the skies. In my opinion, those at fault are the big capitalist corporations making products as cheaply as possible to ensure the highest profit margins possible without taking the damage to the environment into account. On April 22nd, 1970, 20 million people gathered across the country to show their support for the environment. The USA. So 20 million people gathered across the country of the USA to show their support for the environment on the world's very first Earth Day. Earth Day was credited with putting environmental issues on the political map and launching the environmental movement in the United States in 1990. In 1990, Earth Day became a global event. Throughout the last 2 decades of the 20th century, Green parties won national political representation in several countries. They even claimed the office of the mayor in European capitals such as Dublin and Rome in the mid-90s. Okay, the environmental impact of outdoor activities. But as an outdoor instructor in training, I am very aware of the impact on the natural environment that many of the outdoor sports I'm involved in are having. For the purposes of this podcast, I have chosen to take a look at climbing and kayaking as focus points. I will look at the ways the sports damage the environment and the ways in which participants could prevent this damage going forward. So the potential environmental impacts of climbing. Even without looking at the act of ascending the rock itself, rock climbing poses potential negative impacts on the environment. These impacts include soil erosion, vegetation loss, thrash left by climbers on the crag, and general off-trail impact of some of the possible negative effects of the approach to a climb. So before a climber even sets up his gear, there are some environmental impacts even getting into these crags using unknown routes. Okay, the potential impacts of kayaking. So, in my opinion, one of the most detrimental impacts of kayaking is the seal launches and people sliding down the riverbanks to enter waters on riverbanks or lakes. This erodes the vegetation around the riverbanks and causes the banks to widen, making the rivers lower. There's also an environmental issue with kayaks being transferred between different waterways, bringing with them certain types of invasive species that can negatively affect the next waterway they enter with their kayak, unless it's thoroughly cleaned. Next, I want to talk about some of the leave no trace policies, and I'm going to discuss how they come into play with some of the impact on the environment. So, principle number 1, plan ahead and prepare. This is one very important one for me, as I have noticed the bad effects of not planning ahead and preparing. I have went on camping trips without a sleeping bag and had to burn a fire for longer to stay warm, which is not great for the environment, leaving fire tracks. Also, if you forget food or anything, it affects the whole group that you're with. If somebody is complaining, and it just makes the whole trip harder. So plan ahead and prepare is a very important one. Travel and camp on durable surfaces, so just to preserve the natural, the wood floor, and to make sure that you're not disturbing any animals where you're camping. You have to do a recce of the area. make sure that you're not eroding any of the forest or woodland floors, even more so than they are. Third principle is dispose of waste properly. Sounds like an important one, but this goes for everything down to human waste, to brushing your teeth, to washing your hair, to using natural soaps and toothpastes, to making sure that you don't leave any plastic up on the hills or out on the crags or down by the rivers. As we all know, plastic will stay there for a long time and destroy the environment. Also, this will lead us on to principle number 4: leave what you find. Always leave what you find in the mountains. If you take a stone from a lovely beach and bring it home to put on your mantelpiece, and every single other person that goes to that beach takes a stone, suddenly the beach is left without all these beautiful stones. And same thing goes for flowers. You don't want to be picking up too many flowers, because then the meadow will suddenly, all the colours in the meadow will just turn to a dull green after everybody picks up the flowers and leaves them home. I mentioned a little bit about this earlier. So principle 5 is minimize campfire impact. As I said, just only light the campfire for as long as you need it. Make sure that it's on durable ground. You can bring fire blankets and put some sand over the fire blanket and then start the fire on top of that. It's a good way to minimize campfire impact. Obviously bring enough warm clothes and hats and gloves for everybody. That the campfire might not be necessary, especially in summertime. I know it's always nice to have a campfire when you're going out camping, but it's not always necessary and it can damage the environment. So that's minimize campfire impact. Number 6 is to respect wildlife at all times. This is when you're camping, when you're walking, when you're doing anything in the nature, when you're kayaking. Give animals a wide berth. Make sure if they move because of an action that you have done, you're too close. So you should really keep distance with animals at all times. And principle 7 is to be considerate of other visitors. To leave people well alone. Try not to make too much noise, which might upset or distort somebody else's reason to be out in the woods. And that is it from me for this podcast. Thank you very much for listening. All the best.